Season finale of Clearing Confusion, and it's a long one, so settle in, folks. Some video game series have confusing timelines, that's just a fact, but while some are intentionally ambiguous, such as Zelda, and yes, I'll be covering that in the future, so stop asking, some are confusing for other reasons, such as disagreements within the company, retcons, games that are taken in and out of continuity of the series, and translation errors leading to confusion in different regions. Probably one of the prime examples of this is Castlevania. The series has a definite timeline, though it takes effort to track the entire thing down due to various confusing issues throughout the history of the series. I've already done one video about the timeline of the Castlevania games, but that was rather simplistic and didn't explain it fully, so here I am to clear your confusion. Rather than trying to run through the series chronologically, we're going to go via release order with a handy-dandy graphic spelling out the chronological timeline. As you probably know, the first game in the series was Castlevania on the NES. One thing you might not have known is that the game was also released on other systems such as the Commodore 64, Amiga, and even Arcade under the title Versus Castlevania. The game was also re-released much later on for Game Boy Advance and the Wii's Virtual Console, but these are all the same exact games, if not with a few differences in graphics here and there. In Japan, the game is called Devil Castle Dracula, though I've also heard it translated as Demon Castle Dracula. It really is just a matter of preference. Though games of the era had very little in terms of details of the story, thanks to the word of Konami, we can pin down that the game takes place in the year 1691. A few months later in Japan, another game called Devil's Castle Dracula was released on the MSX2 home computer. Although it shares the same name, the gameplay is drastically different, so this is a separate game. It was never released in America, though it came out in Europe where it was given the title Vampire Killer. Although it's a completely different game, the story is the same. It depicts the struggle of Simon Belmont against Count Dracula and takes place in 1691. This means it's essentially an alternate take on the events of 1691. As far as the timeline comes, we're going to consider remakes or alternate takes on a story to be the same game. Since Castlevania came first and is also the most iconic of the two, we'll use that as the definitive version of the story. Next came the sequel. Simple enough, right? In Japan, it's called Dracula 2: The Accursed Seal, and in America, it's known as Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest. The game very specifically takes place a few years after the original, in 1698 to be exact, and tells the story of accursed Simon Belmont gathering pieces of Dracula and destroying his ghost to lift the curse. Next up is a rather obscure game, an arcade game that once again retells the story of the first. Keep in mind, this is not to be confused with the arcade version of Castlevania, but is rather a completely different game, as it tells the same story. In Japan, it's simply known as Devil Castle Dracula, but it was released in America in limited quantities where it is known as Haunted Castle. The story is once again about Simon Belmont, though it gives the twist that in this game, Dracula steals Simon's bride away from him on his wedding day. Once again, it's considered an alternate take on what happened in 1691, so we'll pretty much just disregard it. The game was released way later on the PlayStation 2, though only in Japan, so if you want to play it, you'll probably have to emulate it. And I'll warn you, it's not very good. Anyway, up until now, things are relatively simple. We have the original game and its sequel, and a few games that offer a different take on the first game. But now is where it starts to get confusing. As I mentioned, games of the era were light on story. The in-game story is usually being told in one screen or in very limited cutscenes between levels. If you wanted to know the story of a game, you usually had to read the manual. The thing is, while the games were translated from the original Japanese versions, oftentimes the manuals were not, and the American branches of companies wrote up new manuals based on the English version of the game. There are exceptions to this, but for the most part, this was how it was done back then. Anyway, in the manual of the original NES game, it was said that Simon was the descendant of a legendary Christopher Belmont who had defeated Dracula over 100 years prior. However, in the American releases, there was no mention of Christopher in the manuals. This got confusing when Konami decided to make a game about Christopher's legendary defeat of Dracula for the Game Boy. It was called The Legend of Dracula. However, when it was released in America as Castlevania The Adventure, once again the name Christopher Belmont was completely absent from the game's manual. It seems strange that a game would be released where you don't even know the name of the hero, but it happened. Since Americans had only ever known Simon Belmont as being the hero of Castlevania, and had never heard of his ancestor Christopher, most people assumed that this was another sequel taking place after Simon's quest. However, due to word of Konami and the internet, we know it to take place in 1576, before the first game, making it the first prequel in the series. The confusion went even further in the next game for the NES, which is also a prequel to Castlevania. In Japan, it's called The Legend of the Devil Castle, starring Ralph C. Belmont, while in America the name was changed to Castlevania III Dracula's Curse, and Ralph was renamed Trevor C. Belmont. Once again, the manuals are to blame for a lot of confusion, as Trevor Belmont in the American manual is distinctly described as being Simon's grandfather. We knew it took place before Castlevania, so in America, we knew the timeline as being like this: Dracula's Curse, Castlevania, Simon's Quest, The Adventure. But in fact, we know that The Adventure takes place before Castlevania. So which came first, Trevor or Christopher? For the longest time, people believed that Christopher came first. There are two reasons behind this. One is that Trevor was described as being Simon's grandfather, and the other is that a lot of people assumed the C in Trevor C. Belmont stood for Christopher in honor of the first Belmont. In fact, it's the other way around. Dracula's Curse takes place in 1476, exactly 100 years earlier than Castlevania The Adventure. Next up is the first 16-bit entry in the series for the Super NES, Super Castlevania 4. In this case, there's no ambiguity about the hero's name or the story, as the game itself specifically states the hero to be Simon Belmont, and that he, once again, is called to destroy Dracula. This would mean that in America, we thought we had 4 games starring Simon: Castlevania, Simon's Quest, The Adventure, and now Super Castlevania 4. The issue is the once again was added by the American branch of Konami, as they were not clear on the fact that the game was intended to be a remake of the original, and then in Japan is simply called Devil Castle Dracula, just like all the versions of the events of 1691. So once again, we really don't count it, as it's another retelling of the same events. The issue with Christopher was somewhat cleared up with the next Game Boy release, Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge, which clearly is a sequel to Castlevania The Adventure, and clearly calls the hero Christopher Belmont and refers to his previous adventures. This game takes place in 1591. So okay, deep breath. Here's the timeline so far. We got Dracula's Curse in 1476, The Adventure in 1576, Belmont's Revenge in 1591, Castlevania and its remakes in 1691, and Simon's Quest in 1698. The next game would be yet another remake of Castlevania and was not released in America. It was simply called Devil Castle Dracula and was released for the X68000. Pretty standard stuff, just another game retelling the story of Simon Belmont. Next up was another Japanese exclusive, this time for the PC Engine Super CD-ROM, what we would know in America as the Turbo Duo. The game was called Devil Castle Dracula X Rondo of Blood. This was the first game to introduce a new Belmont that takes place after Simon. The hero was Richter Belmont, a descendant of Simon, though there was also the option to play as his young sister-in-law Maria Renard. The game takes place in 1792. Next, Konami released another new 16-bit game, this time for the Sega Genesis. This one is a bit confusing with the names, so let's talk about that briefly. In Japan, it's known as Vampire Killer, a definite break from the normal naming conventions of the series, and not to be confused with the other Vampire Killer, which was the name of the Devil Castle Dracula game released in Europe. In Europe, it was called Castlevania The New Generation and was heavily censored, which is amusing, as the entire point of releasing the game on the Genesis was to avoid censorship. In America, it's known as Castlevania Bloodlines. As far as the timeline goes, this one jumps all the way to 1917 and is the first game in the series without a Belmont. At first you might think it has no connection to any of the previous games, as it seems to have a lot less to do with them and more to do with the novel Dracula, taking place after it. One of the two playable characters, John Morris, was the son of Quincy Morris, the American vampire hunter who died at the very end of the novel. The other character, Eric Lecarde, is the key to tying it in with the rest of the games, as he wields the Alucard spear, created by Dracula's son Alucard, who first appeared as a playable character in Dracula's Curse. Now back to Rondo of Blood for a sec. Although it was a popular game in Japan, it was still released on a system that was not exactly super popular, so Konami worked on making a version of it for the Super NES. However, what eventually was created was a game that had few things in common with the original, but the gameplay is drastically different. Due to this, we'll consider the next game to be a remake rather than a port. Once again, it has 3 different names. In Japan, it's called Devil's Castle Dracula XX. In Europe, it's called Castlevania Vampire's Kiss, and in America, it's called Castlevania Dracula X. It's worth mentioning, of course, but as it's just another version of Richter's story, we'll not include it in the timeline. The next game in the series is an obvious sequel to Rondo of Blood, even beginning with the final stage of that game. It was released on PlayStation. In Japan, it's called Devil Castle Dracula X Nocturne in the Moonlight, and in America, we know it as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It was later re-released in Japan for the Saturn with added stuff, but pretty much the same game. This one takes place a few years after Rondo of Blood in 1797. The timeline does get easier to follow from now on in, but we'll continue through to the end, as there are bits of confusion here and there, and the next one's a doozy. The next game in the series was to be a prequel to the entire series, an origin of the struggle between Dracula and the Belmont clan and the first chronological game, which would tell of the first Belmont, Sonia. It was released on the Game Boy, in Japan as Devil Castle Dracula Dark Knight Prelude, and in America as Castlevania Legends, and takes place in 1450, only 26 years before Dracula's Curse. The game even ends with Sonia giving birth to a son, who we can assume is Trevor, and it's heavily implied that the father is none other than Alucard, essentially making Trevor Belmont a grandson of Dracula, and all the Belmonts being Dracula's own descendants. This was later changed, but we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. Next we have the Nintendo 64 games. The first one is annoying just because of the name of it. In Japan, it has a perfectly normal name, at least normal for this series. It's called Devil Castle Dracula Apocalypse. In America, though, for whatever reason, they decided to just call it Castlevania. While no one was confusing it with the original, a lot of people took to calling it Castlevania 64, even though that's not the title, simply because it was on the Nintendo 64. The game takes place after Symphony of the Night, but before Bloodlines in 1852. The issue, however, comes up with the next game. Only a few scant months after the successful release of the games, Konami announced a sequel, simply called Castlevania II. Really? Well, thankfully they didn't call it that, but they went and pissed everybody off by revealing the next game was not a sequel, but an enhanced remake of the same game everybody had just played. It seems that Konami rushed the game out and initially intended it to have 2 more playable characters. So they announced the game as Castlevania the Special Edition. Yeah, okay, whatever. But then they changed course again, claiming that it would be a prequel. In Japan, it's a bit more clear. The title of the game is Devil Castle Dracula Apocalypse Supplementary Story The Legend of Cornell. Supplementary stories, or gaidens, are rather common in Japan. In America, it wound up with the title Castlevania Legacy of Darkness. The main issue is when it takes place. Although it has redone versions of the 2 campaigns from the previous 64 game, the main campaign, the one you have to play before you can unlock anything else, stars Cornell and takes place 8 years previous to anything else in 1844. So although the game is all over the map, as it has elements of a remake, as far as we're concerned, the main game is the Cornell story, and we treat it as a prequel. When Konami announced a game called Castlevania Chronicles for the PlayStation, I got excited as I imagined a collection of previous games, but it turned out to just be one game, a remake of the old X68000 game that was in itself a remake of the original Castlevania. Oh well. For the record, in Japan it's called Devil Castle Chronicles, Devil Castle Dracula. Believe it or not, that's not the most insane title in the series. Honestly, I think the Cornell one takes the cake there. Anyway, the next three are all for Game Boy Advance, and are some of my favorite games in all time. The first game is a bit weird, as it seems to have no connections to the series, with a non-Belmont hero named Nathan Graves, and really the only villains, Dracula and Carmilla, being taken from the previous titles. In Japan, the game is called Devil Castle Dracula Circle of the Moon, and for once we got a similar title, Castlevania Circle of the Moon. The game takes place after Symphony of the Night, but before Legacy of Darkness, in 1830. It does seem weird that it would take place only 14 years before Legacy of Darkness, as usually Dracula's resurrections are more spaced out, and to answer this, the creator of Castlevania, Igarashi, later claimed that Circle of the Moon was not part of the series' timeline. But then later he changed his mind and said it was. Since then, it's been taken off the timeline and been put on more times than I can count. Since nothing else in the series contradicts it directly, I'm going to include it, but depending on what Igarashi had for lunch, it may or may not be canon. Next up is an easier one to place, as its hero, Juste Belmont, is distinctly said to be a grandson of Simon Belmont, with the game taking place 50 years after Simon's quest in 1698. In Japan, it's called Castlevania Concerto of the Midnight Sun, the first game in a short-lived run of games to try and use the Castlevania name in Japan. In America, we know it as Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. Last on the Game Boy Advance, we have a rather unusual game taking place in the year 2035, essentially ending the Dracula saga in a rather unique way, and no, I won't give away what happens. In Japan, it's called Castlevania Minuet of Dawn, and in America, it's Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. The next game in the series was to be a prequel to the entire series, an origin of the struggle between Dracula and the Belmont clan, and the first chronological game, which would tell of the first Belmont, Leon. Wait, what? Yeah, it turns out Igarashi had nothing to do with Castlevania Legends, and did not approve of that origin to the series and wanted to tell his own. So Legends was removed from the timeline. Bye, Sonia. What's sad is Sonia, the only female Belmont, was going to appear in another game called Castlevania Resurrection on the Dreamcast, but that game was cancelled. Anyway, now the true origin could be told in a PlayStation 2 game simply called Castlevania in Japan and Europe, and in America it's Castlevania Lament of Innocence. The game takes place way back in 1094, and gives us the origin of Dracula as well as the link to the Belmont family. The next three games in this series are all direct sequels to other games, making them easy to place. First up on the DS is a sequel to Aria of Sorrow, taking place in 2036, a year after that game, and being the latest game in the series chronologically. In Japan, it's called Devil Castle Dracula Crucifix of the Blue Moon, while in America, it's Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. Next, we have a direct sequel to Dracula's Curse on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox in the year 1479. In Japan, it's called Devil Castle Dracula Curse of Darkness, and in America, Castlevania Curse of Darkness. I like it when they're easy like that. Next was a sequel to Bloodlines, taking place in 1944 on the DS. In Japan, they call it Devil Castle Dracula Gallery of Labyrinth, and here we know it as Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. The next game in the series is one of those dreaded mobile games, a wretched thing called Castlevania Order of Shadows. The game stars a previously unheard of Desmond Belmont and is said to take place in the 17th century, but here's the kicker. The game was developed in America and was never released in Japan. That being said, we definitely are not counting that as part of the timeline, which is a relief, as it's definitely the worst game in the series. Next was another remake, this time of Rondo of Blood on the PSP. In Japan, it's Devil Castle Dracula X Chronicle, and in America, it's Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles. It's worth mentioning as it's the first time Americans got to play Rondo of Blood. Although it was an enhanced remake, you could unlock the original version as well as Symphony of the Night. Next up comes the only game that I can't pin down to any particular year. It was released for the DS, and in Japan is called Devil Castle Dracula The Stolen Seal. In America, it's Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. It definitely takes place in the 19th century, though it's never been pinned down exactly when. This puts it in the same century as Circle of the Moon and the Nintendo 64 games. We know the Nintendo 64 games as being in 1844 and 1852, and Circle of the Moon as being in 1830. Konami only counts Circle half the time, but I'm counting it right now. I think it's unlikely that Ecclesia takes place before Circle of the Moon, as that would put it too close after Symphony of the Night. And in Ecclesia, it was said that the Belmonts had mysteriously vanished some time ago. As Circle stars a non-Belmont, I think it makes sense that Ecclesia would be sometime after it. I also think it's before the Nintendo 64 stuff, as Reinhard Schneider is said to be of the Belmont bloodline, just with a different name. And if you've played Ecclesia, you do find out that all the villagers are related to the Belmonts. So it makes sense that Reinhardt would follow this game after Shinoa rescues the villagers. So although there's nothing definite about the year, I'm going to place Ecclesia between Circle and Legacy. Then we have the Wii game. In Japan, it's Devil's Castle Dracula Judgment, and here it's Castlevania Judgment. It's a fighting game featuring characters taken from all over the timeline, from as early as Trevor to as late as Eric Lecarde, though a younger version of him. The game's villain, the Time Reaper, and the main hero, Aeon, are said to come from the year 10,000, but the game actually takes place in a time vortex, which, if you think about it way too much, means that as soon as it's finished, none of the events really happen. So never mind that one. The next game is an arcade game. In Japan, it's simply called Devil Castle Dracula the Arcade. It wasn't released in America, but it did show up in Europe as Castlevania the Arcade. It's a first-person on-rails game with a whip remote that you wave around. Konami, this is what we thought of when we thought of a Wii Castlevania game, not a weird Soul Calibur ripoff. Just saying. Anyway, this can hardly count as the characters are not even named. They're just referred to as Vampire Killer and Lady Gunner and whatnot. Just thought I'd mention the game, but don't worry about it. There was also another mobile game, this time a puzzle game, called Castlevania Puzzle Encore of the Night. Once again, this was released only in America. As far as the timeline goes, it's actually a puzzle game variant of Symphony, so there you go. Next up are the two downloadable titles, neither of which I'd count, but let's talk about them briefly. The first is Castlevania Harmony of Despair for Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network. It's a traditional type of exploration game like most of the games since Symphony came out, but stars characters from all over the place, Alucard, Shinoa, Soma Cruz. It's all over the map. As it's a multiplayer game with no real story, we won't count it. The next is Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth for WiiWare, which is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a remake of Castlevania The Adventure. Unlike the aged Game Boy game, I actually highly recommend this one. It's pretty awesome. This brings us to the latest Castlevania game, the big-budget blowout Castlevania Lords of Shadow. The game takes place in 1047, which would place it even earlier than Lament of Innocence, and it stars Gabriel Belmont. I won't give away a lick of the story, as I know some people who still haven't played it or are still playing it, but that being said, it's simply a reboot of the series. Although it doesn't erase what came before, it basically starts a new timeline separate from the rest. So there it is, the full Castlevania timeline. I'm just going to go ahead and leave it up for a bit while you enjoy some music from Lords of Shadows. That being said, Clearing Confusion will be going on hiatus for a bit as I prepare episodes for the second season, so keep an eye out for 10 new episodes coming in a few weeks.